The train did not sigh when it left. It heaved a great, final cough of steam and metal and pulled away from the platform with the indifference of a tired animal. It left behind the heat, the bone-white dust, and her. She stood where she had been placed, a parcel forgotten on a shipping dock. Her feet were bare against the splintered wood, the soles of them already filmed in the fine, pale grit that covered everything in this sun-scoured town. Her dress was a thing of rags and memory, the color bleached out by suns she could not recall and journeys she wished to forget. She did not look up. To look up was to invite notice, and notice was the first step toward pain. She kept her eyes on a particular knot in the wood of the platform, a dark, swirling eye that seemed to understand her stillness. The sounds of the town washed around her like a sluggish tide. The jingle of a harness, the sharp clap of a screen door, the low murmur of voices that rose and fell without ever becoming clear words. They were just sounds, part of the oppressive heat. A man in a dusty bowler hat spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed perilously close to her bare foot. It sizzled for a moment in the heat, a dark stain spreading on the pale wood. She did not flinch. Her world had been shrunk down to this small circle of endurance. The man who had brought her here, the man whose name tasted like ash in her memory, had told her to wait. His final words had been a curse, a promise of abandonment spat over his shoulder as he boarded the train. "You're bad stock," he had said, his voice loud enough for the station master to hear. Not worth the feed. And so she waited. For what, she did not know. The sun climbed higher, pressing down on her head like a hot palm. The murmurs from the general store across the dusty track grew louder, punctuated now by a woman's sharp, derisive laugh. She could feel their eyes on her, picking her apart like vultures. They saw the frayed hem of her dress, the dirt on her cheek, the way she stood as if she were a post driven into the ground. They saw an object of scorn, a piece of human flotsam washed up on their respectable shore. She made herself smaller, tried to breathe less air, to take up less space. She clung to her silence as if it were a shield. It was the only thing left that was hers. The afternoon began to bleed into a softer, though no less hot, light when a new silence fell over the town. It was not the absence of sound, but a change in its texture. The lazy chatter from the store ceased. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer faltered. She felt the shift before she saw its cause, a sudden tension in the air, a collective holding of breath. She risked a glance, lifting her eyes from the knot in the wood just enough to see beneath the brim of her own exhaustion. A shadow had fallen across the platform, long and sharp in the slanted light. It belonged to a man who seemed to have been carved from the mesas themselves, tall and broad, his presence absorbing the light around him. He was Apache, that much was clear from the high cheekbones and the straight, black hair that hung unbound past his shoulders. He wore simple buckskin trousers and a worn cotton shirt, but he stood with a stillness that made the dusty town look flimsy and temporary around him. He carried whole winters in his eyes. He was not looking at the townspeople who now stared at him with a mixture of fear and resentment. His gaze was fixed on her. It was not a leering gaze, not the assessing look of the man who had left her here. It was heavy, quiet, and unreadable. He took in the bare feet, the ragged dress, the way she held herself like a bird with a broken wing trying not to be seen. He saw the story of her, written in the dust and the weariness. The station master, a man with a belly as soft as his principles, finally found his voice. It was thin and reedy. "She's vagrant," he called out, emboldened by the silent audience at his back. "Gotta run her off for dark. Belongs to no 1 inch." The tall man did not turn. His eyes remained on her. He took a slow step forward, then another. The dust did not seem to rise around his worn boots. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for her to see the fine lines etched around his eyes, the faint, pale scar that cut through one eyebrow. He smelled of pine smoke and dry earth. Section he looked from her to the station master, a long, silent appraisal that seemed to measure the smaller man's soul and find it wanting. Then he looked back at her. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, a sound that seemed to come from under floorboards. "She comes with me." It was not a question. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact, as simple and unmovable as a stone. The station master sputtered. "Now hold on. You can't just—" The Apache man reached into a small pouch at his belt and pulled out 2 silver coins. They were old and worn smooth. He tossed them onto the platform. They landed near the station master's feet with a soft, final clink, shining against the dusty wood. He did not wait for a response. He had not been asking for permission. He turned his gaze back to her. He did not reach for her, did not make any sudden move. He simply held her eyes with his, a silent question passing between them. It was not, "Will you come?" but something more fundamental. It was an acknowledgement of her existence, a recognition that she was more than the object they had all taken her for. She felt a tremor start in her hands. A thing she had suppressed for so long, she had forgotten it was there. For the first time in days or maybe weeks, a choice was being offered. One path was the continued waiting, the inevitable cruelty of the town, the slow fade into nothing. The other was this man, this stranger, this mountain of quiet resolve. He was a mystery, a potential danger, but in his eyes, she saw not possession, but purpose. She took a single, shaky breath. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted one foot from the hot, splintered wood and placed it in the dust of the road. Then the other. She stood before him, a waif in the long shadow of a giant. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and turned. He began to walk away from the town, his pace measured and slow, not looking back to see if she followed. He knew she would. She did. She walked behind him, her bare feet silent in the thick dust that lifted behind them like ghosts. The eyes of the town were daggers in her back, but she did not look back. She kept her gaze on the broad, steady line of his shoulders, a fixed point in a world that had just tilted on its axis. The journey was a long stretch of silence. The town fell away behind them, shrinking until it was just a smudge of heat and resentment on the horizon. The landscape opened up, vast and indifferent, a sweep of cracked earth and hardy scrub under a sky the color of a faded bruise. The wind, which had been only a hot breath in town, turned mean out here, whipping strands of her matted hair across her face and forcing grit between her teeth. He walked with a long, ground-eating stride, yet he kept the pace slow enough for her bare feet. He never looked back, but she knew he was aware of her every step, of the way she flinched when her foot came down on a sharp stone. The silence between them was not empty. It was a physical thing, a space filled with the howl of the wind, the crunch of their footsteps, and the weight of everything unsaid. After an hour, when the sun was a blood-orange smear on the western rim of the world, he stopped. He unslung a canteen from his shoulder and held it out to her, his arm extended back without turning his head. She hesitated for a moment, her thirst a living thing clawing at her throat. It was the first act of direct kindness she had been shown in more time than she could measure. Her hand trembled as she took the heavy tin vessel. The water was warm, metallic, and the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drank slowly, carefully, then screwed the cap back on and handed it back to him. His fingers brushed hers for a fraction of a second, his skin rough and warm. She pulled her hand back as if burned. He took the canteen without a word and they continued on, walking into the deepening twilight. The world turned to shades of purple and gray. The air grew cooler, raising goosebumps on her arms. His home was not a house. It was a cabin, hunkered low against a small rise, almost invisible until they were nearly upon it. It was made of dark, weathered wood, the lines of it straight and true but unadorned. It looked less like it had been built and more like it had grown out of the earth it stood on. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, a pale ribbon against the darkening sky. Beside the cabin, enclosed by a simple fence of woven branches, was a small, lonely patch of earth marked by a wooden cross. It was weathered and gray, but the ground around it was clear of weeds. He led her to the door, a solid-looking plank of wood, and pushed it open. It swung inward without a sound. The inside was one room, clean and spare. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire crackling within it, casting dancing shadows that made the small space seem to breathe. There was a sturdy wooden table with 2 chairs, a bed built into one corner with a neat stack of wool blankets, and a simple cot against the opposite wall. The air smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and a faint, lingering scent of sorrow. The place was functional, but it was haunted by an absence. It was the home of a man who was profoundly alone. He gestured toward the fire. "Warm yourself." She moved toward the hearth, drawn by the heat. She held her hands out to the flames, feeling the warmth sink into her chilled skin, into her bones. He moved around the room behind her, his steps quiet on the packed earth floor. He ladled something from a pot hanging over the fire into a wooden bowl. It was a thick stew, rich with the smell of rabbit and wild roots. He set the bowl on the table, along with a spoon and a cup of water. He did not sit with her. He took his own bowl and sat on the floor by the far wall, his back against the rough-hewn logs, giving her the entire table, the entire fire. The unspoken contract was laid out in that simple gesture. Here is food, here is warmth, here is space. He ate slowly, his gaze directed at the fire. She ate the stew with a hunger that was almost painful. Each spoonful was a small miracle of flavor and heat, chasing away the cold that had settled deep inside her. When she was finished, she placed the bowl and spoon back on the table, her hands moving with a quiet reverence. He noticed she was done. He rose, took her bowl and set it aside. He then gestured to the cot. "That is yours," he said. "The door is not locked. It is never locked." She understood the meaning behind the words. "You are not a prisoner here." She looked at the cot with its thin mattress and single, coarse blanket. It looked like a king's bed. She gave him a small, jerky nod, the first acknowledgement she had offered. He seemed to accept it. He banked the fire for the night, leaving just enough glowing embers to keep the chill at bay, and then retreated to his own bed, turning his back to the room. She lay down on the cot, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin. The wool scratched her skin, but it was a solid, real sensation. For the first time in a long, long time, she was inside. She was warm, and a door was unlocked. In the deep quiet of the cabin, punctuated only by the soft sigh of the embers and the low moan of the wind outside, she closed her eyes and did not dream. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of a life stripped down to its essentials. A routine began to form between them, unspoken and unnegotiated. He would rise before the sun, his movements quiet as he rebuilt the fire and went out to tend to his traps or check the fences that marked the boundary of his small plot of land. She would wake to the smell of wood smoke and the soft light creeping through the single window. At first, she did nothing, simply sitting on her cot, watching him, trying to understand the shape of this new existence. She was a guest, a piece of salvage. But the idleness felt wrong, a weight in her hands. On the third morning, while he was gone, she found a broom made of bound twigs and swept the packed earth floor. The work was simple, the swishing sound a small, satisfying rebellion against the silence. When he returned, he did not comment on the clean floor, but his eyes noted it, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. The next day, she tidied the stack of bowls and sorted the few dried herbs she found hanging from the rafters. She discovered a small, neglected garden patch behind the cabin, choked with weeds but with a few stubborn squash vines still clinging to life. She spent the afternoon on her knees, pulling the weeds with a methodical patience, her fingers digging into the cool, dark soil. The work felt good. It was real. It was something to build, not something to endure. He worked in parallel. She would watch him from the corner of her eye as he mended a section of fence, his large hands surprisingly deft as he knotted the rawhide strips. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet competence that spoke of a long familiarity with this harsh land. They were 2 solitary planets, orbiting the same small star of a cabin, aware of each other's gravity but never colliding. The small gestures began, tentative as new sprouts after a frost. One afternoon, while clearing the garden, she found a single, tough wildflower, a splash of defiant blue against the brown earth. On impulse, she took it to the lone grave beside the cabin and laid it at the base of the weathered cross. She saw him from a distance, standing perfectly still by the fence line, watching her. He said nothing when he came in for the evening meal, but the silence felt different, less empty. A few days later, she found the handle of the garden hoe, which had been cracked and splintered, wrapped tightly with fresh strips of leather, making it solid and comfortable in her hand. He had fixed it while she slept. That evening, as they ate their silent meal, she began to hum. It was a tune she did not remember learning, a simple, wavering melody that seemed to rise from a place deep inside her. He did not look up from his bowl, but the rhythm of his spoon against the wood slowed, just for a moment. One night, the past came for her in her sleep, a dream of locked doors and a man's heavy breathing, of rough hands and the sour smell of whiskey. She woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright on the cot, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The room was dark. The fire burned down to a faint, pulsating glow. A shadow detached itself from the far wall. It was him. He was standing there, a dark, silent shape against the darker wall. He had not lit a lamp, had not rushed to her side. He was just present. "You are all right?" His voice was a low rumble in the darkness. "A dream," she whispered, her own voice thin and shaky. He was silent for a long moment. "The doors do not lock here." He repeated the words from her first night. It was not just a statement of fact. It was a promise, a reassurance meant to soothe a specific fear he could only guess at. He moved to the hearth and placed a small log on the embers. They sparked and flared, catching the dry wood, and a soft, golden light pushed back the shadows. He did not return to his bed. He sat on the floor by the fire, his back to her, simply keeping watch until the trembling in her limbs subsided and the steady rhythm of his breathing lured her back toward a fragile sleep. The next evening, the air was thick with the coming of a storm. They sat by the fire, the wind rattling the wooden shutters. The tension of the approaching weather seemed to have seeped inside, making the silence heavier than usual. He had been carving a piece of wood, his knife moving with slow, deliberate strokes. He stopped, resting the half-finished shape of a bird on his knee. He looked at her, his gaze direct. "Why did he leave you at that station?" he asked, the question dropping into the quiet room like a stone into a still pond. She flinched. The question was a key, turning a lock on a room she had kept sealed shut. She looked down at her hands, clasped in her lap. "I was purchased," she said, the word tasting like poison. "To be a wife. For a man in a town farther west. But I got sick on the journey. A fever. By the time we arrived, the man had found someone else. I was damaged goods." She did not tell him the rest. The part about the man who bought her, Silas, trying to get his money's worth from her anyway. The part about her fighting back. The part about him calling her a feral cat and deciding she wasn't worth the trouble of breaking. He listened, his expression unchanging, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. He looked at the grave outside, a fleeting glance. "I had a wife," he said, his voice soft. "Her name was Sarah. The fever took her 2 winters ago. The house has been quiet since." It was the most he had ever shared, an offering of his own pain to balance hers. It was a bridge built across the space between them, fragile but real. He looked at her again. "You have a name." She shook her head. The name she had been born with belonged to a girl who had died a long time ago, on a dusty road somewhere else. The names she had been called since were not names at all. "No," she said. "I don't have one." He considered this for a moment, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Lena," he said, tasting the sound of it. "It is a name from a language my grandmother knew. It means light." He was not commanding her. He was offering it, a gift. "Lena," he said again, as if to settle it in the air between them. "Lena." She tried the name on in the quiet of her mind. Felt strange, new, like a clean dress after wearing rags for a lifetime. Felt like a beginning. For the first time, she met his gaze without flinching, and she gave him a small, hesitant nod. In the flickering firelight, surrounded by the sound of the rising storm, she was no longer just the woman. She was Lena. Life settled into a new kind of quiet, a shared silence that was comfortable rather than empty. The name he had given her began to take root inside her. Lena. When he said it, it sounded solid, real. The garden she tended began to thrive under her care, producing small, hardy squashes and a line of green beans that climbed bravely up the strings she had made for them. The house itself seemed to have changed. It no longer felt haunted by an absence, but rather filled with a quiet presence. It breathed again. He taught her things without lessons. She learned to read the sky for rain by watching his gaze. She learned which roots were good for stew and which were poisoned by the way he would nod or shake his head as they walked. He, in turn, began to rely on the small changes she brought. He would find his worn shirt mended with neat, almost invisible stitches. He would come in from the cold to a fire that was already burning bright and a pot of something warm simmering over it. They rarely spoke of the past. It was a landscape they had both crossed, and there was no need to look back. But one day, he found her staring at the small bird he had finished carving and left on the mantel. It was a simple, elegant thing, its wings half spread for flight. "You are a good carver," she said, her voice soft. He picked it up, turned it over in his large hands. "My father taught me. He said you have to see the shape that is already inside the wood. You don't make it. You just set it free." She looked at him then, and understood that he was talking about more than wood. The piece was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over deep water. They both knew it. The harbinger came on a hot, still afternoon. It was not a letter, not a rider. It was a plume of smoke on the horizon, rising from the direction of the low pass that led back toward the settled lands. It was too thick for a traveler's campfire. Chayton saw it first. He had been splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar heartbeat for the homestead. He stopped mid-swing, his body going rigid. Lena, who was hanging washed clothes on a line, saw the change in him and followed his gaze. The smoke was dark, greasy. It spoke of something made to burn, something unnatural. "Go inside," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Stay away from the window." He did not run. He simply retrieved his rifle from the cabin, checked the load with a calm efficiency, and then went to stand by the edge of his property, a silent sentinel waiting for the trouble he knew was coming. They came an hour later. 3 riders, emerging from the heat shimmer like demons. Lena watched from a crack in the shutters, her heart a cold stone in her chest. The man in the lead was Silas. He looked heavier, angrier, his face flushed with sun and drink. He had the same look of spoiled entitlement she remembered so well. They reined in their horses just beyond the fence line, their mounts nervous and skittish. Silas surveyed the scene. The neat cabin, the thriving garden, the woman he thought of as his lost property clearly visible in the doorway that Chayton now blocked. A sneer twisted his lips. "Well, look at this," Silas called out, his voice thick with contempt. "Playing house with a savage. I knew I smelled something rotten on the wind." Chayton did not reply. He stood with the rifle held loosely in one hand, its barrel pointed at the ground. He was as still and unmovable as the hills behind him. "I've come for what's mine," Silas said, swinging a leg over his horse. He strode toward the fence, his hired men fanning out behind him. "The law says she's my property. I have a bill of sale. Paid good money for her," he spat on the ground. "She owes me." "She owes you nothing." Chayton's voice was dangerously low. "She is not property. Go back the way you came." Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "And who's going to make me? You? The law doesn't much care what an Indian thinks. Now step aside before my friends here have to move you." It was then that Lena moved. The fear was a cold fire in her veins, but something else was burning hotter. A rage she had not known she possessed. The girl who had stood mute on the train platform was gone. The woman who had been left to be picked apart by strangers was gone. She was Lena. This was her home. She stepped out of the cabin to stand beside Chayton. She did not have a weapon, not a real one. But as she moved, her hand closed around the handle of a heavy iron skillet she had left by the door. Her knuckles turned white. Silas's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in fury. "Get back in the house, you stupid girl. This doesn't concern you." Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the tense air with the sharpness of glass. "I am not yours," she said, her gaze locked on his. "I was never yours." The defiance stunned him. He had expected a cowering animal, not this. He took a step toward the fence gate, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. "I'll drag you out of here myself." Chayton moved. He did not raise the rifle. He simply took one step forward, placing his body squarely in front of Lena's. The sheer, silent power of his presence was more threatening than any weapon. "You will not touch her," he said. The words were not a threat. They were a statement of absolute truth. "This is my land. She is my wife." The word hung in the air between them. Wife. He had not said it to her, not before this moment. It was a claim, a shield, a wall of stone built around her in an instant. Silas hesitated, his bravado wavering in the face of Chayton's unyielding calm. He looked at his hired men, but they were shifting nervously in their saddles, their eyes on the big Apache and the rifle he held so casually. This was not the easy fight they had been paid for. They saw the look in Chayton's eyes, and they saw a man who would die on this patch of dirt before he gave an inch. They also saw a man who would not die alone. From down the track, another sound. A horse, ridden hard. It was their neighbor, Mr. Jensen, a wiry old farmer who had traded Chayton for cured meat before. He held an old shotgun across his lap. He didn't say a word, just stopped his horse a ways off and watched. His presence was another weight on the scale. Silas saw it all. He saw the woman who would not cower, the mountain of a man who would not break, the neighbor who would not look away. His claim, built on paper and pride, crumbled to dust. The fight went out of him, replaced by a sullen, impotent rage. "This ain't over," he snarled, but the words were hollow. He backed away, climbed clumsily onto his horse, and wheeled the animal around. "You'll regret this." He threw over his shoulder as he and his men galloped away, leaving a trail of dust and empty threats. They stood together, watching until the riders were nothing more than a speck on the horizon. The silence that descended was profound. The adrenaline drained away, leaving Lena trembling. The heavy skillet slipped from her numb fingers and clanged against the packed earth. Chayton turned to her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were dark with the storm that had just passed. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the rifle from where it leaned against the cabin wall and set it back inside. "You didn't run," he said, his voice quiet. She looked up at him, at the man who had named her, who had stood for her. "This is my home," she said, and she knew it to be the truest thing she had ever said. He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. He bent down and picked up the fallen skillet, his large hand wrapping around the handle. He held it for a second, then held it out to her. It was a simple gesture, a return to the ordinary, but it felt like a vow. She took it. Their fingers brushed, and this time, she did not pull away. That night, after the silent meal, he did not go to his bed immediately. He added another log to the fire, and in the renewed light, he walked over to a small, carved wooden chest in the corner, one she had never seen him open. He lifted the lid and took something out. It was a simple silver band, thin and worn. He came to her where she sat on her cot. He knelt so his eyes were level with hers. He held out the ring. "This was Sarah's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She would have wanted. She would have liked the garden." It was his way of saying everything. His way of offering not just protection but a place, a future, family. Tears welled in Lena's eyes, the first she had shed in this place. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a deep, aching gratitude that was too big for words. She held out her left hand. He slid the cool, smooth ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He did not say, "I love you," he did not need to. The words would have been too small for the vast, quiet space they had built together. Instead, he simply said her name, a confirmation and a promise. Lena. A year later, the cabin was the same, yet entirely different. Curtains that Lena had stitched from flour sacks hung in the window, softening the harsh afternoon light. A small, sturdy cradle, carved by Chayton from the same pale wood as the mantelpiece bird, sat near the hearth. The lone grave still stood under the sky, but now, 2 wildflowers graced its base. They sat on the small porch he had built, watching the sun dip below the mesas, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet. Lena was humming her quiet tune, rocking the cradle with her foot. Chayton was carving again. Another bird, this one with its wings fully spread, ready to soar. The house behind them was no longer silent. It breathed with the soft sounds of a life being lived, a family being built, stitch by stitch, with raw thread and unspoken kindness. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. And in the ashes of 2 broken lives, something new had not just waited. It had taken root and it had begun to grow. So you see, this story, it ain't just about a rescue. Any man with a strong arm can pull someone from a fire. No, this is a story about seeing. It's about one soul looking at another and seeing not a broken object, but a person waiting for a name. It's about the quiet courage it takes to offer a piece of your own brokenness as a bridge for someone else to walk across. Most folks go through their lives shouting, trying to make sure the world knows they're there. But the real connections, the ones that last, they're often built in the silence. They're in a shared bowl of stew, a mended shirt, an unlocked door. They're in the space between the words. So here's your naming. Think about the quiet kindnesses you've been shown. The silent protectors who stood for you when you couldn't stand for yourself. Those aren't small things. They are the cornerstones of a life. And if you're lucky, if you're brave enough to stop and listen to the silence, you might just find that the home you've been searching for isn't a place at all. It's a person, and they've been waiting for you the whole time.